helping out. Welcome everybody to today's talk of the Biodiversity Seminar Series, which is entitled Tales of Transformation, Critique and Meaning of Biodiversity, Narratives. And very thrilled that so many of you have found the way here, despite the fact that the seminar is taking place at a different time and a different place and with all these new arrangements, but we have made it and we can start now. It's my pleasure to introduce our today's guest, Dr. Claudia Keller. Her background is in German linguistics and literature, general and comparative literature and art history. And she's currently a senior research assistant at the German department of the University of Zurich. I've actually large introduction, but I don't know whether we should skip. I mean, she brings together literature and environmental humanities, and what stands out is her strong commitment to transdisciplinary openness and environmental issues, which is reflected both in your research, then also you're a member of the Swiss Forum of Biodiversity, etc. You're co-curating exhibitions and so on, so you're very engaged. And yes, it's from the beginning of next year, Claudia will be an assistant professor at the University of Fribourg, and she's received several awards and grants and continues to inspire new ways of thinking about literature, ecology, and transformation. So, Claudia, it's an honor to have you here. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's kind and honoring introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really looking also forward to the discussion afterwards because I'm presenting something completely new for me. I'm going to speak about a project who hasn't already started yet, so I'm really open for any suggestions and comments. And yeah, as you saw, I'm going to sit down for obvious reasons. I really can't stand so long. And I hope that, yeah, my brain will send me the right words for this presentation. Yeah, it was already said. What is my background? What I'm going to present today is this project of the SNSF starting grant, which will take place at the Institute for Environmental Sciences and Humanities at the University of Fribourg, which will start next year. And I'm really coming from very classicist German literature. My PhD was about Goethe, and I developed towards contemporary political literature and towards biodiversity. But I think what really is an important focus of all my project is this relation between nature and culture and the cultural perception of nature, starting in the 18th century and going until the present. What is really important to me is outreach and science communication. So I just brought you 3 examples of such little texts I've written about the importance of language and the potential of cultural studies for the biodiversity discourse. You can find these online. And what I also try to do is to reach a broader public and to interest this broader public for biodiversity topics. For example, with these articles, one on endangered species and the emotions like sorrow or anger we might have when looking at the biodiversity crisis, or one article about gardens and the problematic conceptions of what is a beautiful garden, or the third one, how Switzerland is drowning in manure. This was quite controversial. I got a few angry emails after this publication. So these were published in Das Magazin of the Tagesanzeiger, so one of the most read weekly magazines in Switzerland. You can find the PDFs of these articles on my website, or if you want, you can also write me an email and I'm happy to send them to you. What I'm going to develop scientifically, and I'm also going to talk about today, you can read in a very preliminary form in this article, which was published in the journal Gaia last year, which is also this title, Narrating Variety, and 3 theses on the meaning of narratives for this, for the biodiversity discourse. You can also find this online. So, but I will start with a very brief insight in this new project that was already mentioned, Narrating Variety, Biodiversity as Paradigm of Transformation in Science and Literature. So, I will work on this project until 2030, when the emissions will be down and everything will be fine and solved. So, but what we are observing now, I think this is a very common observation, that we still have an underestimation of the biodiversity crisis in public opinion and on the political agenda. And what we also can observe, that in science communication for biodiversity, there is like the insight that facts are not enough. We need to communicate differently. We cannot just repeat the facts again and again. So we have an increasing call for better stories on biodiversity. We need a story revolution, etc., etc. So I think this is a good insight, but it is not enough, because what I observed is, how should these stories look like? Nobody really knows so clearly. So what I'm trying to do is, I think we need an analytical and normative perspective on biodiversity narration. And I'm trying to develop such a perspective in my project at the Uni Fribourg. So this is one of the main goals of this project. Biodiversity narratives exist in very different societal fields. In my project, I will distinguish between narratives in science, policy, and society, like in research programs or in the media. I showed here 2 examples. And on the other hand, I will look at how biodiversity is narrated in the cultural discourse. And with my background coming from German literature, mainly in literature, but I will also integrate like the important media today, such as movies and series, Netflix series, etc. So the first objective of the project is to make really a comprehensive analysis of all the existing narratives in these fields. And then the second objective is to gain insights from this analysis and the overview of the existing narratives, in order to establish criteria for an appropriate and responsible use of narration in future biodiversity campaigns in Switzerland. So it has this analytical and this like normative or practical aspect in the project. So I distinguish between like the public discourse, and I also see here that it's scientific discourse and this cultural discourse. And like this is a heuristic distinction, you could always question it, but that's the way I'm doing it. And along with this distinction goes another distinction, which is quite important for my work. I distinguish between narratives in a stricter sense and stories in a more open sense. So my hypothesis is that in this field of science policy and society and media, we will mainly encounter narratives. And narratives, for me, follow a certain pattern. They are characterized by repetition. They reduce complexity in order to give orientation. And they are an important force in shaping cultural traditions and worldviews and beliefs. So narratives are identity forming, they are action guiding, they are potentially mobilizing, and they always go hand in hand with certain solutions we might find in conservation, and they will exclude other solutions because they really suggest something is the right thing. So one of the very common narratives we had, for example, in the US, is the American dream, that you can really start as a person washing the dishes and then you become a millionaire. This is a story you have in very different forms, and it's always the same, and it's really connected to this American dream and identity. And on the other hand, we have stories. And my hypothesis is that we will have stories in this more open form in the cultural discourse, in literature, in movies, etc. And they are more open, diverse, individual, and they create space for complexity and for ambivalence. So you don't have this is good and this is bad, but like you have it is both and it is more complex, and you have to look at this more different, like to make a difference. So stories are less mobilizing, but they have an important function for reflecting on dominant societal narratives. So I think stories, they pick up certain narratives we have in our society, they reflect on them, and they also try to critically reflect on them and to change them a little bit and to create space for other ways of narrating a certain topic, and also for narrating in our context biodiversity. So I see a very big potential in these cultural stories to change a little bit the structures of the biodiversity discourse. And I will now show this with a concrete example. And this example is the metaphor and the narrative of invasive species, which is still very common today. This morning I talked about this topic with my students in Zurich, and they confirmed me that it is still used very much in their seminars and in the teaching. So as you might know, the origin of this narrative lies in the era of the Cold War, when in the year of 1958, Charles Elton published his book, Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants. And I will just read the first 2 sentences of the first chapter of this book. Maybe you all know it, I don't know. So the invaders. Nowadays, we live in a very explosive world. And while we may not know where or when the next outburst will be, we might hope to find ways of stopping it, or at any rate, damping down its force. It is not just nuclear bombs and wars that threaten us, though these rank very high on the list at the moment. There are other sorts of explosions, and this book is about ecological explosions. So you see, I think it's very interesting how he makes this very strong analogy between the nuclear war, the Cold War, or the nuclear threat, and ecological explosions. And I could now really give you in detail examples also from popular culture, how this fear of invasions, like it could be the fear of the communist brainwashing or the fear of aliens coming down on Earth, and in the movie The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, you might know it, you have the aliens coming in form of plants. So we have really this alien and invasive plant species together. So this discourse is really omnipresent in society and in popular culture at this time. And Elton uses the metaphor of invasive species in the context of this zeitgeist, and ever since we use it in this in invasion biology, etc., in media, etc. And what I think is interesting is that we still use this metaphor and this context, although our present now is quite different from how it was during the Cold War. But you also might know that there is a rising critique coming from different scientific and societal fields to this metaphor and narrative of invasion. And I'm just going to present you two forms of this critique. The first example is this book by Jessica Hernandez. She's an indigenous environmental scientist, and the book is called Fresh Banana Leaves. And I will just read you the following passages. I have sat in many presentations about invasive species where they have been called the devil, evil, or nightmares. However, the irony that lies within these descriptions is that for many who practice restoration or are in the environmental sciences, most of these invasive species are their plant relatives, as these were introduced during colonial times by settlers and colonizers. And she continues, what Western conservation, environmental sciences, and restoration continue to teach us is that anything that is not native is not welcomed to the flora or fauna landscapes. However, this rhetoric is never applied to humans, as we seem to be the exception for our own laws, rules, and regulations that we only apply to our environments. This alienation is only applied to vulnerable communities, such as our Central American climate and war refugees, because they are ostracized thanks to current immigration laws. And it's not. It's like logical that Trump, for example, he uses this word invasion quite a lot when he speaks about the immigration at the southern, between Mexico and the US. So what does Hernandez here? First of all, she recalls the negative metaphors that go along with the common narrative of invasions, and then she switches the perspective and she evokes the colonial context. And she makes this irony visible that invasive species are actually the displaced relatives of those who call them invasive species, but which had been the European colonizers. So the narrative of invasive species with this perspective turns out to be a repression. In German, we would say Verdrängung. Like with this psychoanalytical term, a repression of Western colonial history. And in the second paragraph, she exposes this hypocritical attitude of ignoring this one's own immigration history, and then to distinguish between native and non-native only when it goes along with some very vulnerable immigrant communities. And then she finds another story and metaphor to describe her perspective on these species. And in the paragraph which I'm going to read now, she tells how she and her students removed the Himalayan blackberries, the armenische Brombeere, which is a very thorny and invasive plant in the US. The cuts the Himalayan blackberry would leave reminded me of using this as a metaphor to teach my non-Indigenous students about the pain colonization has left on Indigenous peoples and communities. The metaphor related to the pain these cuts would leave and how they symbolized components of the pain we Indigenous peoples continue to endure because of settler colonialism. This was also a percentage of that pain we carry as Indigenous peoples because colonization has hurt us, fractured our communities, and continues to impact our Indigenous landscapes. Many of my students were non-Indigenous, so using this metaphor allowed them to metaphorically grasp the pain. So with the cuts of the plants on the arms of the students, the pain of the Indigenous peoples becomes tangible for these students. And the cuts are the metaphor for the cuts that the people, like the invaders, have inflicted on the Indigenous people. And so it is a symbol also for this pain that is still widespread in these communities. And yeah, I think it's interesting how with this new metaphor, she shows how the narrative of invasion reverses who is the invader and who is the victim. And she tries to correct this false perspective or this false balancing, and also tries to correct the injustice which has happened, but which still goes along with this narrative. The second example comes from German literature, as you will see in a few seconds, and it is about the sea walnut, Meerwalnuss, which in Europe is an invasive species, which is framed in newspapers often as monster, which eats their children, and all these very dramatic metaphors and things that go along with this narrative of invasive species. So this species, which has a very bad reputation, is one of the central characters of this novel by the Austrian author Marie Gamilschek. And the novel is called Aufruhr der Meerestiere. And in the novel, we have as another main character, Louise. She's a scientist who does her research on the sea walnut and views this species in a very broad way. She sees it as a symptom of problematic human behavior, as a danger to ecosystems, but also as a very fascinating species. So she's really fascinated by this sea walnut. And when teaching her students, she explains why she doesn't like the metaphor invasive species. And I will read the first paragraph. I will read it in German. You can follow in English if you want to. Wir wollen also Lebewesen nicht als invasiv bezeichnen, wenn sie nachweislich nicht freiwillig in neue Ökosysteme ziehen, sondern vom Menschen eingeschleppt werden. Und wissen Sie, wenn wir hinter die Angst schauen, sagte sie, wenn wir die Meerwalnuss nicht als invasiv, auch nicht als räuberisch oder kriegerisch bezeichnen, dann können wir von ihr lernen, wie man sich selbst den schlimmsten Lebensbedingungen anpassen, in ihnen sogar nicht nur überleben, sondern gut leben kann. And while she's speaking to her students, she also thinks about other metaphors and images to describe the sea walnut. And some examples that she creates in her mind while teaching the students are eine schwebende Laterne mit weiten, zarten Flügeln, eine durchsichtige Plastiktüte verloren auf See, eine feingliedrige Lichterkette in einer klaren Nacht vom Wind angetippt. So Louise sees in the sea walnut not only a monster, but also a role model for life in times of ecological degradation. And her metaphors, which she creates here, they allow us to see other aspects of this species, which go further than its invasiveness. And in another paragraph of the novel, Louisa reflects on her inability to describe the sea walnut in an adequate way. Wir halten die Meerwalnuss für ein primitives Tier, weil sie kein Herz und kein Hirn hat. Dabei besitzt sie eine Körperintelligenz, die dem Menschen gänzlich abhanden gekommen ist. Dass die Worte an dem Tier scheiterten, hatte Luise immer schon gewusst. Aber auf einmal schien ihr allein der Singular nicht nur unzureichend, er war falsch, betrügerisch gar. Die Meerwalnuss war doch immer nur der Schwarm, war immer nur eins. And a little bit later, die Meerwalnuss führt das Fortschrittsdenken des Menschen ad absurdum, sagte sie, und gleich überfiel sie ein Ekel vor dem Wort Fortschritt, weil sie nicht wusste, wer es schon vor ihr in den Mund genommen hatte. So human concepts as such as intelligence, singular or plural, or progress, they not only prove to be inadequate for describing this species, but it also becomes clear between the lines that these limited ideas of us humans, of what is intelligence, etc., are also partly to blame for the ecological degradation and for all these problems we have, for which the sea walnut is a symptom. So she really criticizes all these human concepts such as progress to make visible that this is the problem and not the behavior of this species. So what does this novel? It does several things. First of all, it is important to notice that it raises awareness for the problem of certain neobiota. So like if someone who just likes to read literature and was never confronted with this topic is now learning really a lot about invasive species. But at the same time, it also critically reflects on this common narrative of invasion. And I have just tried to show this with a few bullet points. So in contrast to the anthropomorphization, like to make something like humans in the usual narrative, because invasive species in this narrative, they behave like military operators. It reverses the perspective and it allows us to see other aspects of this species rather than only focus on the excessive spread and the destruction. It creates new images and associations, which then allow us to go beyond the feeling of fear and to see, for example, the body intelligence, which is based not on individualism, but on the swarm. And that this swarm intelligence maybe could also be exemplary for us humans when we have to adapt to ecological crisis. And finally, the novel also criticizes this very common pattern of the heroic story, which is always a battle between good and evil. And it shows how to tell other more complex and big stories about these species. So you can see again how we have the narrative of invasive species, and how then the story of literature in the cultural discourse tries like to reflect on this narrative. And this is like a mini case study, which I will really try to do in a broader way in my project, and from which then I hope to create an overview of how these narratives work. And this overview, I think, is a very important task, which is like it's important for improving biodiversity communication in the future, but it has only been addressed in a very in initial stages. One example is this paper by Lauder and Weiborn, which I can recommend, and they at a certain point try to give such an overview of biodiversity conservation narratives. But I think this overview, I will not like go in the details, but it's helpful, but it's very unspecific, and it combines also different levels. So it's a starting point, but it has to be really worked on. And another starting point we have is an article by Gabriele Dürrberg. She's an German and cultural literary scholar in Germany, and she tried to give such a very general structure of narratives in the Anthropocene. So it's not on biodiversity, but I think some things are in common. For example, this big division between the catastrophic or the transformation narratives. We also can see this in biodiversity. So these are like initial tries to give such overviews, and my aim is to refine this with regard to biodiversity in these different societal fields. And since the project has not even started yet, I cannot give you such an overview yet, but what I can give you is an indication maybe of the axis that I consider to be central for such a future overview. And first of all, it is the modus, like how is biodiversity narrated with focus on extinction and in dystopian, like catastrophic scenarios, or with a focus on richness, variety, which has this kind of utopian and transformative aspect. This is one important division. And traditionally, biodiversity was associated always with utopia, richness, and variety. I've just brought two images. They are small now, but the upper one is naming of the animals by Adam in the Garden Eden. So Garden Eden is the paradigm for biodiversity, where all animals and humans live in harmony together, blah, blah. And the other, like semi-utopian or reaching from dystopia to utopia, is the story of Noah's Ark, where Noah saves all the animals from the catastrophe. So this focus on richness and variety and utopia is very much linked with the history of the concept. And now we have more often these dystopian narratives for obvious reasons. Second, I think it's interesting to ask, what is the perspective? Is it from a human perspective? Is a story like narrated from a human character, from the perspective of a human character? Or are there also an inclusion of non-human perspectives? Like Robin Wall Kimmerer, the book about mosses, how to see the world through the lens of other species. This is such an example. And it's also this question of, do we anthropomorphize, like make more human, or do we also respect the alienness of other species? Then what is the object of the narrative? In biodiversity, we are always confronted with this problem that we have this very abstract and the level of the system, biodiversity as a very complex system, or do we have a more concrete perspective like the interaction between two species or the focus on one species, for example? And then what is also important for me is to ask what values does a narrative or a story convey, which ethical, aesthetic, and affective, like emotional values are conveyed in the story, and do we have an instrumental, intrinsic, or relational perspective? And I just brought you these two examples of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which is a very concrete metaphor and which evokes certain aesthetic and emotional contexts when we hear this or see this image of the Silent Spring. And in contrast to this, the campaign for the biodiversity initiative, which was preserving our preserving our livelihoods. Yeah, you can introduce it like this. So this is very abstract and focused on instrumental values. It does not have all these aesthetic and emotional like value that Silent Spring may have. So this was now the first part of my talk, and in which I showed like how I deal with narratives and with stories, and I tried also to show how complex this is from with all these different values and which come together in stories and narratives. And in the second part of my talk, I would like to focus a little bit on the function of narratives in the current political situation, because I really noticed during the development of the project, which was like lasting over 3 years, that at the beginning I was just, we need like stories and how can stories contribute. And now with this really great shift in politics, I start to see more and more that we have to really critically ask how narratives are used today. So it's not enough that we say in our community we need to create better stories for biodiversity, but we also have to reflect how narratives are used by the other side and how can we react to this. So what we notice, I think, is that after years of climate change denial that we all know, and there have been books about this, we can now also see increasingly a denial of the biodiversity crisis. I am showing here this very interesting I think it's a comment in Nature, Ecology and Evolution. Biodiversity scientists must fight the creeping rise of extinction denial. I really can recommend this text. And in this context, it becomes even clearer, I think, that facts won't save us. I'm really pro facts, so facts are important and we have to communicate facts and so on, but they won't save us not only because it's not appealing enough, but it's also because we're confronted so much with narratives that are a tool for disinformation, but they can also be a tool to fight against disinformation. So I think this topic of narratives becomes even more like urgent in this context. And what really also I'm starting to question myself is do we see now, for example, the end of the diversity paradigm? When you think about Trump, who erases this term from all the websites and programs, like in the social context, what does this have as effects also for biodiversity, which is a term that historically is connected very much in the 80s to the rise of social diversity, and it has the word diversity in it. So the question is, to what extent the conditions of the discourse are now changing fundamentally? Like, do we have an end of the diversity paradigm in this like political context? And how do we have to adapt our speaking and our narratives of biodiversity in this context? Not to be like, yeah, that we still get funding, for example. It's very existential, I think. So these are the broader questions, and now I'm going to show a little bit how like this denial and disinformation was really also used during the campaign against the Biodiversity Initiative last September. I think we are still shocked a little bit about the outcome, not about the no, but like about the how much no it was. Yeah, we could really see how dominant denialist narratives, like there is no biodiversity crisis, have been spread over the media and politics. And I can recommend you this article in the online magazine Republik, in which for which I also have contributed and have tried to show the different forms of denial which have happened during this campaign. So the first, like the literal, explicit denial is the crisis is denied directly. There is no biodiversity crisis. And then say, it's only about terminology. I don't like the term crisis and so on. But it's really not about this, but it's about denying how the situation is. Then the second move is what we call interpretative denial. This is when you have this cherry picking of data to present the situation more positively, or also false balancing, when you overemphasize certain data and neglect other contexts. And then you have the more implicit and the indirect and also harder to see forms of denial, which have been also very present in this discourse, because the government always said, yeah, we do so much for biodiversity, we have all the instruments, we have all the measures, etc. So the positive effects of the existing measures are overemphasized to not, in order not to see what is still missing. And this was like the semi-level. Now I'm going to, again more into detail and show how Albert Rösti dealt concretely with these issues. So on the occasion of the Biodiversity Day in May 2023, like before the initiative, he has visited a family in Bern, which has a natural and biodiverse garden. And he praises in this video the personal commitment of this family. And then he comes to the following conclusion. Für mich ist besonders wichtig, dass Biodiversität nicht nur im ländlichen Raum, sondern besonders auch in der Stadt, wo sehr viel Boden versiegelt ist, gefördert und auch gepflegt wird. And this, it may seem harmless because it's also kind of true. Like conservationists always say, Biodiversität im Siedlungsraum is important and we have to make our balconies greener. So it's not false, but what goes along with this becomes clearer, I think, when we look at a very similar statement he made during the debate in the parliament, where it was concretely about this Gegenvorschlag and the initiative. Yes. Okay. So I'm not. Yeah, I'm not going to read this, but I just tell you the conclusions, and then I'm nearly at the end. So what he does is that he hijacks and inverts this narrative biodiversity in urban areas in the intention it originally had. It is used as an excuse not to enforce stricter measures in agriculture. So he shifts the focus on urban areas and excludes like agriculture. And it reinforces this polarization between urban and rural areas, which is like one of the core topics of his party. And he also connects this to core issues of the party, like immigration. So in these two examples, you really can see how biodiversity and excessive immigration is connected. And that's why I think, as a conclusion, narratives are not good or bad in themselves. We really have to ask who uses which narrative in which context and for what purpose. And luckily, there has been a lot of research about denial in very different contexts. Here, 3 reading tips, and this might be helpful also for biodiversity, like to translate this. So these are my conclusions. I don't have to read them all. Yeah, I think I can stop here. And thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to this.
Chat. You can write it in the chat if you have a question for people that are following online. We have probably, I don't know, 10 or 5 to 10 minutes. Would you like to leave at 12 exactly? Or maybe
I think who has to go can go.
Okay.
And
who needs to go can leave, but maybe 10 minutes discussion would be nice. So who has a question for Claudia? Elena? Thank you very much.
I'll bring the computer. It's the microphone. So you can ask the question in the microphone.
Yeah, so in the introduction, you explained the difference between the stories and the narratives. And I see a lot of value now in both of the forms. And I'm wondering what is like your conclusion on, or the conclusion from the research that you're doing. Like, do we need more narratives or do we need more stories? Or like, do we need better narratives? Or yeah, like what is the like advice for the future? I would ask.
yeah, but I think we need both, and we have both, and we will have both. But like I'm just a little bit skeptical that we can create actively narratives. I think narratives are really collective, societal, connected to societal values. We can just try to move and like stretch narratives a little bit to criticize them, etc. But I think it's really difficult to create narratives out of the blue. We can create stories which like position themselves to certain narratives in a different way, and then we can hope that with like cultural change they become new narratives which are shaping culture again. So I think there are really different tools, and we can, I think, create more on the story level, and we have to reflect and criticize more on the narrative level.
I heard from
Sorry.
From your presentation, I get that it's not sufficient to just communicate facts when we want to convince a larger group of people. Do you think we should do that as individuals to tell stories, or should we also agree on a story, for instance, as an institution on very important subjects? For me, this is very important as a discussion, because if any individual tells his own story, we may disagree and we may leave an imprint of inconclusiveness within science. While I think that, for instance, the Farmers Association of Switzerland, they're very careful in how they communicate as an organization.
Lobbying is always connected to a very concrete and strict narrative. So the stricter and coherent and omnipresent your narrative is, the more impact it will have as a lobbyist tool. I think it is, first of all, important that in our communities we discuss more about what are our narratives. Sometimes we also tell what are our visions. So this is the first of all a discussion we have to have, and then it's certainly important that on within certain frames of value and like what is important and what are the, like, do we focus on instrumental or relational values. So we have to agree a little bit, but then we also have to allow variety. I think it's not a right way to have like this only master narrative how to solve the biodiversity crisis. Biodiversity needs a diversity of narratives, but I think we're not at that point yet. But first of all, we really have to try to elaborate a little bit on what should be a common communicative narrative in a certain context, like such as an institution. And which like goes along with our facts. It's not an opposition between facts and narratives, but how to convey the facts in these narrative forms.
So is the aspect of narratives, how they impact the individuals, also analyzed? Because I often get the idea that the narrative of science about climate change and biodiversity is that we are in a grave situation and we need to do stuff quickly. And everything that we are currently doing is not enough. So that might be true, but the impact on the humans is that if it gets saturated like this, people tend to go to the conclusion that we cannot do anything because it's too much. So just fact-based narratives probably are not enough, because otherwise people get upset or they stagnate and they don't do anything at all. So is there also the aspect of the impact on what these narratives do?
Yeah, so thank you very much. This is a very big discussion, like which emotions and values going along with which narrative are helpful or not, like resignation, hope, and all this kind of stuff. And it's true. So yes, this is being analyzed, and But like for my project, I have to say I'm not a social scientist, so I'm not coming from psychology. I'm not analyzing how people empirically react to narratives. So I'm in like taking in this discussion. I'm also trying a little bit to integrate this, but it's not my methodology as a literary and cultural scientist. But yeah, I can assure you that this discussion exists, and it's very important, yeah, to take these insights also in this discussion.
So thank you very much for this very interesting discussion. I think looking at the time, we need to close now because there's another group waiting to do yours, I think.
Yeah, that's
So,
probably what we need.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Claudia, and I invite you to come to lunch together if you want to continue to discuss.
Yeah, and
Thank you very much.
yeah, thank you very much. And you can also just write me an email or get in contact if you have other questions.